Hello and welcome to the Comedians Paradise. This is the podcast where we speak to comedians, mavericks of the comedy world. Now, today's guest, he has been a writer for one of my favorite sitcoms, My Family. He wrote what he was involved in and produced and was the co-host of a brilliant podcast called Sitcom Geeks. He has been in the British currency for over 35 years. Please welcome the brilliant, the fantastic, the amazing Dave Cohen.
God, I'm got a lot to live up to there, but thank you. Thanks for that, Mark.
Now, for anyone that hasn't heard of you, Dave, tell us a bit about who you are and like how you became a comedy writer, because you've really done a lot of things in comedy. Like you were stand-up, you've written to sitcoms, read a podcast series on sitcoms.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yes, I've been around, I've been around a long time. So it kind of started when I was in my teenage years, which showing my age here. That was the era of punk, and punk in the late 70s, 1970s, changed everything, and everybody who wanted to try and do something different became a punk, and they often went into bands. But also a lot of people who loved comedy but weren't kind of quite as au fait with the whole comedians scene of the 1970s. It didn't speak to us as teenagers. The kind of the blokes with the frilly shirts and the bow ties who did jokes about mother-in-laws and foreigners. And it wasn't that we were, kind of politically active or anything. That just didn't talk to us really. And so punk was where a lot of the great comedy came from, and a lot of the people who first became successful in comedy in the 80s started as punks. And in the late 70s, I was a student. I went to Edinburgh, and our student show at certain times. So I ended up in the same pub every night as another bunch of students who went to Manchester University, a group called 20th Century Coyote, which was Rick Mail and Ade Edmondson. Mm-hmm. And so I got to know them when we were all students in the late 1970s. And, we didn't really know what it was then. It wasn't really called anything like stand-up comedy. It was just like a new thing. It was like punk theatre, I suppose, would be how you'd describe it. And I saw their show called Death on the Toilet. It was in 1979, and that show that kind of changed my life really. That was the show that made me go, oh, this is what I want to do. And they went off and they started the Comedy Store Players, the comic strip and all that stuff. And I went off and trained to be a journalist. But then when they went off and became hugely famous, there was this kind of circuit in London in the early 1980s that was just starting out, but suddenly they didn't have anyone to play it because all the people like Rick Mail, Alexi Sale were way too big to play in these little rooms above pubs. So I was very lucky in the early 80s. I moved to London and became a comedian just because there were more comedians. There were more venues at that time than there were comedians to play them. So a lot of my generation, we were very lucky. People like myself, Paul Merton, Joe Brand, Jack Dee, Harry Enfield, we were able to kind of learn our trade in relative anonymity. So by the time people got to find out what alternative comedy was, we'd had sort of 2 years practice at it. So it kind of fell into it by accident, really.
And in your sort of day, what am I saying? Your sort of day, but in the 80s and the 90s, that was where comedy paid bloody well. You didn't need to do anything else. Now, I'm hearing I hear sort of stories of Harry Hill or a lot of big names when the first paid gig. That's way more than a lot of people get now. He says you'll be lucky to get that now.
Yeah, we were incredibly lucky, and In fact, somebody, Harry Hill, published a thing a few years ago. It was like a list of all. It was like a week. No, it's like a month of gigs at a place called the Camden Head, which is just a room above a pub. 70 or 80 punters, and they did Friday and Saturday nights, and there's all our names are listed there of all the who's headlining, and then the other names, and there's people like myself, Owen O'Neill, Harry, Paul Merton, and we've all got, there's like, you got 80 quid for doing the gig. And a lot of people saw this about 4 or 5 years ago, and they said, blimey, they were getting more money in 1986 than I'm getting in 2025, you know. So it's true. We were, you know, and it was all cash, and you were allowed to sign on and work as long as you weren't working more than 11 hours a week. So we were signing on legally, working, doing 4 20-minute gigs a week, which was quite a good wage in the 80s. So yeah, it was financially, it was a very good time to be doing it.
And that time, a lot of people had more money to throw around. It's not like things are now, but also there's not as many people trying to be comedians or as many comedy clubs. It's more of a novelty. Now, like, comedy is quite saturated in a way in the UK and America, isn't it? To a degree.
Yeah. I mean, what we had in London was the equivalent of, it was like the sort of music scene in the 70s. So you'd have a room, somebody would put on a gig in a room above a pub and charge £5. They'd get, like I say, they'd get about 80 people to come to it, and they'd make 400 quid. The pub was very happy because they were selling 80 extra lots of alcohol. So they weren't asking for money for hiring the room. They were getting lots of money from people drinking. We were like 4 or 5 acts, and there was like 400 quid between us, and we all just split the money that way. So it didn't need to be like a huge thing. It was just, 50, 100 gigs or so. And these people coming in, it did start to get a little bit more professional when the Comedy Store started up in 1985. And then you had Jongleurs at the same time as well. So they started to kind of scale it up, and it became much more of a kind of business thing at that point. And then the colleges got involved, and more people saw it and thought, oh, I want to be a comedian. So there were loads more comedians and fewer places to play. So yeah, pretty quickly the demand for comedians wasn't as big as the supply.
What would you say the point? Because I know, I heard so many things about the Comedy Store. Like, it used to be a strip club. I know that Don Ward used to set up with someone else. There's some people that don't like Don Ward, and they said that he's a failed comedian. I don't know about that. I won't go into details on that. And then there's, Jongleurs. I heard so many things about it. Like, on the weekends, you could do 3 Jongleurs gig, and that'd be your pay for the week. And I'm like, how the hell did they do that? Because there's no way that could happen now with and get it all packed like that. I know that the lady was Marie Paint's Girl, whatever it was, but yeah, how has it just suddenly changed so much where the pay's so much less and it's so much harder to make a living?
Well, just to talk about Don Ward for a bit. I mean, Don recently, I went to his 90th birthday celebrations at the store. Don.
Wow.
So, Don has always been around, and yes, he was always he was a club owner in Soho in the 60s and 70s, which invariably meant, music and strippers, basically. But he loved comedy, and he still loves comedy, and he set up the Comedy Store in about 1979. That was the original Comedy Store. That was the one that Rick Mayall and that lot all went to, and that closed down fairly quickly. But then they came back in 1985, and Don really, to his credit, he stuck through thick and thin with the Comedy Store. He was able to make a success out of a small club in the West End, and he turned it into a bigger club, into like a 400-seater club in the West End, and he never really wanted to do much else other than just have these. I mean, there was a comedy store in Manchester for a short period, but yeah, I think it's fair to say that in the 80s and 90s, comedy became a very big, very successful thing, and as a live thing, it was very successful. But then, I guess, I mean, everything really after 2008. I'm sure that's not the absolute starting point, but when the economy crashed in 2008, lots of things never really, really recovered, and the whole culture of live comedy, late night comedy, all that stuff, it kind of pretty much plateaued or fell by then. And then when COVID came, that almost killed off stand-up completely. So stand-up has been it's pretty much been in decline since 2008, and it's been a steady decline. And I think Jongleurs was always a bit of a kind of business venture, and comedians were, it's much more like a kind of entertainment corporation, and comedians were always kind of, not quite the most important aspect of it. It was late night place, booze, disco, high end, night meal. But it was really, really hard to play. You really felt the audience weren't there to see you, whereas the Comedy Store was always about going to see the comedians. But yeah, it just became, I guess it became a bit like football, really. You've got the whole live comedy scene. You've got a dozen or so very, very successful comedians selling out tours, thousands and thousands of people go to see them. And then everyone else there's a kind of very small middle section, and everyone's trying to get into that. And then everything below that is just, there's a huge gap. And then there's all these hundreds and hundreds of people just doing free gigs. And, nowadays you have to bring your own mates to your gig or you won't get a gig, which is just, what's the point? What's the point of that?
Well, you may as well just set up your own gig if that's it's getting more, especially in the new material nights. It gets to the stage with the gigs that are on offer. You may as well be every comic just set up a load of their own gigs and just. But admin seems to be a disease for most comics that they want to avoid. Admin's always been a.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of comics. That's always been how it has been. So the comics who weren't quite, and even back in the 80s, the comics who weren't quite good enough to get regular gigs from other venues set up their own clubs, and some of them became very successful. But nowadays, I think, if you want to set up a comedy gig somewhere, it's kind of, it's hard to set one up and charge. There are so many free gigs around as well, and it's like you say. I think you have to be into the admin side of things, really. I think to really want to do, if you really want to do it. But I think it is pretty much the only way you're going to get regular gigs is if you set up a room in a pub and determine to go down there every week and try out stuff. But yeah, getting a local audience, how do you get a bunch of people out? I mean, as it happens later tonight, England are playing in the World Cup. I always remember that every 4 years, June and July, you book gigs in advance. You forget there's a World Cup on, and you sort of go to a gig expecting 100 people, and there'd be like 3 people in the room. So it's always been a little bit of a kind of risky venture.
Yeah, I was speaking to a comedy club owner in Singapore, and he says during the World Cup, it's the Lemon Stand football club. It's not the comedy club. He said it killed business, but it's yeah. I don't know. Maybe you could do them as a joint package, but they're a bit. I mean, they're drunk, and they come and, you're doing comedy as well. Yeah, it's just going to be a difficult thing, and people finish work at 5. The game will start in a couple of hours, but it is, yeah. I think the only way to do it is to do it as a package, isn't it? To do like comedy and the World Cup.
That's a good idea, actually. I'm surprised no one. I mean, maybe some people have tried that. I guess anywhere, most pubs now, they've got big screens, haven't they? So I guess you could get away with like a 6 till 8 comedy gig, maybe. That would be a good idea. Yeah, and that you get to watch the football after. I think it is. I kind of find, I don't know. I don't know what it's. I don't really go to comedy that much anymore. I kind of didn't. Once I stopped, I did it for 10 years as a stand-up, and I kind of sort of lost its joy for me after a while. I mean, that's partly why I stopped doing it, was because it stopped being fun for me. But I have occasionally been to see gigs, and I think it's what I find different now is that people are much better, much slicker on the stage, because they've got so much stuff they can watch. You can learn how to look like a good stand-up on the stage. But what we had, my generation, we were terrible at that. We were just shambolic performers. We didn't really have anything to go on, but we kind of learnt it on the job. But we were also a bit more, it's like you're saying, we were more maverick. There wasn't really, it wasn't a career to be a stand-up. It was just a kind of exciting thing. It was like, pin money, and you could just go to a pub and do stand-up for 20 minutes and get enough money for your food for a week. That was, and you live in a nice flat in London. I mean, God, stand-up comedy, I managed to get I was a friend of mine who's sadly no more, Jeremy Hardee. He and I, we bought a flat together when we were in our late 20s in Clapham, and I mean that was just all that was cash that we'd made from being stand-ups. And I checked the other day, and the flat that we bought for and got a mortgage for 50 grand or something is now on the market at 750 grand. So it's just ludicrous, really. So it's just a completely different world.
Jeremy Hardee, oh my God, yeah. I mean that's it's so mental that, and yeah, the amount you could sell a flat now is incredible. But with Jeremy Hardee, I've heard so many things about the guy. Like I heard from his friend John Fleming, and like off stage he was really shy, but on stage he'd be completely mad. Like at the Up the Creek, people used to change the glasses to plastic because people kept throwing it at him. And then I heard that John set up the Malcolm Hardee Award. In terms of like, these are the kind of acts that he would have liked. But yeah, he was such a legend that people talk about now.
You're mentioning John Fleming there. I think I'm wondering if you're talking about Jerry Sadowitz. Actually, Jeremy Hardee was like he was a very different comedian. I mean, they were both absolute stormers. They both did brilliantly, but Jerry was the legend who people threw glasses at. Jerry was Jerry was definitely a completely different person on stage to the person he was off stage. He was, and still is, sweet, polite, charming, lovely guy, and I think he still is. I haven't seen him for years, but as soon as he got on the stage, he kind of the sort of angry Glaswegian came out, and yeah, John Fleming was very kind of important in keeping Jerry's career going, as Jerry would just get it banned from places all the time. He just a number of times that I would do a gig with Jerry Sadowitz, and he'd engineer it so that he got kicked off within 30 seconds. Not, he wasn't trying to get kicked off, but he just thought, what's the most offensive thing that I can say to these people when I walk on, and if they accept that, then I'll keep going. But Jerry is still with us. Jeremy Hardee, although very, very funny and very successful comedian, and almost, probably almost the polar opposite of Jerry on stage. Very quiet, shuffling sort of character, but brilliant gag writer.
But Malcolm Hardee, what were the stories about him? Malcolm Hardee, the guy that the award.
Malcolm. I mean, he was whatever you've heard about Malcolm, it's probably true.
Huh.
I mean, he really was. He was again, he's the sort of person now that would just not stand a chance. He was, he's been in prison for 5 years. He stole Freddie Mercury's Rolls Royce. That's what he got into prison for 5 years, and in fact, subsequently, his cellmate was a guy called Wizzo, who became my manager among other comedians. But Malcolm was just a kind of he was a chancer, and he was a legend in Deptford, where he sort of grown up.
Huh.
And he set up this club called Up the Creek, and I played there a few times, and I mean, it really was a bear pit, but it was a fantastic club, because the audience were, they adored Malcolm, and Malcolm made no attempt to kind of say, "Oh, welcome to the club, and we got some great acts for you, please go." He'd say, "Okay, next act's on. I saw him a few weeks ago, and he was a bit shit, but I think he's a bit better now, and so please welcome Dave Cohen." Off he goes, and that was your kind of introduction you got. So you're kind of in a kind of battle of wits, because a lot of these people were very funny. A lot of the crowd were as funny as the act. So sometimes you were in a real kind of battle of wits with the people. You had the mic, so you were kind of in a slightly better position. But yeah, Malcolm was a complete charlatan, really. I think. But yeah, he was. But he also, he drank excessively, and that kind of was responsible for him falling off a boat and drowning. And in Deptford, in the docks in Greenwich or somewhere, there, and so it was a kind of extraordinary life that he had, and extraordinary funeral as well. And he was just a kind of just a person who made that world just a little bit more colourful when he was around it. But it was hard working for or with Malcolm, but it was always entertaining in the end.
Basically, he was a character.
Yeah, he was a character.
Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've heard. You hear that with a few characters. I've heard that twice now. So there's a guy called Django Edwards in the clown community who I've heard a lot of mad things about. And the person who met him, John Townsend, says if you'd met him, whatever you've heard about him is probably true. And there's twice I've heard that about some of these characters.
Yeah. No, Malcolm was a one-off, definitely. But as I say, you just wouldn't get a Malcolm. No, I think I would be surprised if anyone like him emerged now. I just can't quite see it. I mean, he came from a very much of that sort of that world of the kind of Deptford, the South London gang culture. It was a tough old world, really, and a lot of small time gangsters. So yeah, I'm not sure how many of them would find their way into the world of alternative comedy these days.
What was so you mentioned all the things about comedy going down, but what was it that made you get into, like, switch entirely to comedy writing? Because I do love stand up as a whole, but one thing I found through doing a sitcom writing course, the process and the way they work, from my experience, I mean, you know a lot more and all that, but I feel that the process is vastly different in a way. And like, when I'm writing a sitcom, it feels like I'm pranking people with a lot of severe personality faults. Whilst a stand-up, it feels like you're the personality fault, and you've got.
Yeah, that's a very nice way of summing it up. Yeah, I think. I mean, I stopped doing stand-up because I was not bad at it, but I wasn't good enough at it to kind of get to the next level. So I kind of I'd been doing it for 7 or 8 years, and then all these people who'd only been doing it for 2 or 3. So all my generation, they all started to do very well. All the people like, kind of, like I mentioned, like, Paul Merton, Joe Brand, and Julian Clary, Harry Enfield. So they were all doing really well, and I was still sort of at a certain level. But as long as they were still my generation and they were kind of getting on, I felt, yeah, I'm still in the game. But then a lot of these new people came through, people who were younger than me, who'd started after me, like Harry Hill and Al Murray and people, and they leapfrogged me pretty quickly. I stayed at the same place, but I'd see them, Eddie Izzard, so I'd see them when they were starting out, and then I'd see them at my level, and then I'd see them getting much better than me. And I just thought, maybe, I mean, I was too young to work out what was not working, but I think looking back on it now, I just wasn't good enough. And I was a writer, I love writing. I'm obsessed with writing. So you're right. It's a different kind of writing. The performing of being a stand-up is, yes, you've got to have good material, but you can get on with not such good material if you're a good enough performer. But if you've got great material and you're not a good performer, you can't succeed as a stand-up. So you just, as a stand-up, you just have to be, you're not just a writer, you're kind of listening to you're aware of the vibe in the room, you're responding to the vibe in the room, you've got an energy that you're able to give to your material, you've got a way of selling your material, which is, like you say, it's you, but it's like an exaggeration of you.
Yeah.
And if you haven't got if your persona is not quite on the right track as you are as a stand-up, then you're kind of, you're not going to connect with the audience. But yeah, sitcom is much more. It is more like theatre than it is like stand-up, and it is about flawed characters who go out and they do stuff. So it's kind of, so there are more stories there. So it's like a character does a thing, and that thing gets them into trouble, and that's a sitcom. I think the nearest equivalent, I mentioned My Family and things, but I also wrote a lot for a show called Not Going Out with Lee Mack, and Lee is probably the best example of somebody who is able to be both fantastic stand-up comedian and a sitcom actor. But he's not, and a sitcom writer as well. But by his own admission, he much prefers the performing to the writing. But he can write himself as long as he's surrounded by brilliant actors. And he's not a bad actor, but he's not the best actor.
Yeah.
But he can hold his own in a sitcom, being the person that he is when he's a stand-up. And I can't think of anyone else in Britain in the last 20 or 30 years who has managed to transfer what he does as a sitcom, as a stand-up, into the sitcom form. And he is brilliant at that. Yeah. So yeah, sitcom is more about a flawed character being proactive, doing something, and that thing getting them into big trouble. And then because it's a sitcom and it's only half an hour long, they have to come back and they don't learn anything from their mistakes, but they have to learn just enough to get from the mess that they've got themselves in the episode back to where they were at the start. So, Del Boy, he's determined to, next year we'll be millionaires. He cuts corners. He gets into trouble. He gets out of trouble. Not enough to go, oh, I realise what I did there was wrong. I shouldn't be cutting corners. I should be being more honest and trying this. He just thinks, okay, next time I won't get caught. That's all he learns. So he's back next week to make a mistake and get caught and wheedle his way out of it again.
This may be a difficult question, and I know I definitely didn't put it in the list of questions, but from what you've said there, it's made me think of a question. And you said you wrote for my family. My funniest, I loved my family when they had Nick in it, but I sort of tuned off a bit when he left. But the funniest bit from my family was when Nick and the family go on a holiday in Spain, and they were in all sorts of trouble. And then the guy checks Ben's camera to see what's going, see that he wasn't taking pictures of his missus. He looked through it and he finds out later, goes, "Oh, that's disgusting. What's that?" And then they all look at that and say, What's this? Nick, what's this? Pictures of your bum? And then Nick goes, "Oh, I've not seen it before." And that was so funny. And what I think is a brilliant moment of that is that Nick is just a mad idiot who would try anything. He doesn't care about how it comes across or the consequences. Whereas Ben is a miserable git. He knows all the consequences is probably much severer. And that's what makes a lot of the dynamic between him and Nick so brilliant. But what's the thing with a stand-up where they write a brilliant bit that fits their persona? So one person I would say that's a good example of that is Milton Jones. He deliberately does that weird, stupid hairstyle like a mad scientist, like he's an experiment gone wrong. And then I remember seeing him on live at the Apollo. I'm chatting. I bumped into him once on the tube, and I said hello to him, and I made him uncomfortable. But I chatted to him. He was nice and polite. But then when I saw him at the Comedy Cafe closing, he avoided me. But it's fine. I made him awkward, but he. I love his bit where he says, somewhere between murder and suicide is a place called Merseyside. But I don't know. If you gave that joke to anyone else, I'm not sure it'd be the same. But the fuzzy hair, the slow pace, the delivery of Merseyside, it just sounds like someone's. Well, it doesn't look like someone's taking drugs, but it sounds like someone who's been in a lab experiment and just come up with a thought out of nowhere.
Yeah. I mean, Milton is a fantastic example, along with someone like Gary Delaney, for instance. These guys, they just write joke. They know who they are on stage, and it's not so much a performance. It's the jokes. I mean, for Milton is a craftsman, really. So he builds lovely jokes, but everyone you say, I mean, I've not heard that Merseyside joke. That's a typical fantastic Milton type joke. But for everyone that you know and everyone that you see him perform, he's rejected probably 10 or 15, So in the 80s, we set up my kind of gang of stand-ups. We set up a thing called New Material Nights, so we would have these kind of fortnightly things where we try out new material. It's become quite a kind of popular thing now with comedians, but at the time it was just we were just trying to find new ways to do things. But I've seen Milton a few times at New Material Nights, and he's standing there. He's got 30 cards in his hand, and he reads one, and he reads the joke, and he kind of gauges the audience, and that goes in the pile there. He does the next joke. Oh, I read that wrong. I'll have to try that next week, blah, blah, blah. And then he's got a next one. And, he'll probably, from those 30 jokes, 5 minutes of material, he'll maybe use 4 or 5 of them ultimately. So he'll reject loads of them. So he works, he just spends his life crafting perfect little jokes. And that's the kind of key for people like him. They have a really strong work ethic. And that's the way to be a great writer, is you have to write loads and loads and loads and loads, because most of what we write isn't quite good enough. Half of what we write is okay. Then 3/4 of the rest of it is quite good, and then there's like the 5% of what you write is good enough, is really good, that it's at another level. And so that's why people like Milton succeed, because they chuck away the 95% that lesser comedians would use.
Yeah. It's also remind me a bit of, I keep saying this in the podcast, but I talk about jiu-jitsu a lot. And the thing that I like about jiu-jitsu is that it teaches you to lose a lot to get the reward. And I feel that sometimes with joke writing, it's the same. I'm not that good a joke writer, but I've seen the same process with other comics where they've done that. It's like be prepared to lose a lot before you find the golden nugget, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's something that I've kind of changed my view on a bit over the years, because I help quite a lot of people get their first professional comedy writing credit. So I've been running courses, running sort of feedback things for a few years now for new writers to write for TV, for a radio show called Breaking the News, which is on Radio Scotland, and another show called The Skewer, which is on Radio 4. And they use lots and lots of material from new writers. And what I've come to see over the years is that the writers who come to us with jokes, and you're allowed to send something like, 40 jokes a week to Breaking the News. And the writers that usually succeed in getting credit are consistently sending 40 jokes a week to Breaking the News. And, after 3 or 4 weeks, maybe one of those jokes will get used. But people who send 10 jokes one week and 20 the next and 5 the next week, and they don't get it on, it's just they're kind of, you just need to be doing it. It's like, say, jiu-jitsu, that wouldn't surprise me at all, is that you're just, if you're training 2 hours a day, you're going to be a lot better than someone who turns up once a week. You're just going to be more au fait with it, and you're going to know all the kind of ins and outs of it. And you do have to be a little bit obsessed. I think that's part of the key. It's one thing to say, "Oh, I love comedy. I'd love to write comedy." But then you just have to be so obsessed with it that anyone listening to you talking about it would just think, God, he's such a nerd.
Well, one thing I've found with comedians, it's one thing that's a very hard thing at the moment with a lot of comedians. Now you have to do so many things. You've got to be good at social media. You've got to run your own shows. Sometimes you've got to run your own podcast and social, not just be a comedian, but there's a bit of advice that I had for someone who wasn't a comedian but runs a business, and I think I would like to run another podcast that isn't just comedy. But he says that what's made him successful is that, and he learned from playing poker, is that he limits his options. And I feel that the biggest mistake I've made being involved in comedy is spreading myself too thin and not seeing how difficult the thing that I'm really working on is.
Yeah, it's a thing with writing as well, because a lot of people, and I've seen it because I've written in the last 2 or 3 years or so, I've been writing novels as well. I'd never written a novel, and partly because I just thought it's too big a thing. Wouldn't know how to do it. I mean, the thing that I'm most well known for, I think, is for the songs that I wrote for the kids' TV show Horrible Histories. And, those songs are like 200 to 300 words maximum. And they've got a basic structure, they're structured like songs, and songs are basically verse, chorus, middle eight, chorus, and they kind of mimic what it's like to write a comedy sketch, which is, like set up, big first joke, consequences of that, it's the second verse. And so I'm very familiar with that form. But then to write something that's like 80,000 words long, it's just, what the hell? And you just have to kind of break it down into smaller steps. So I would say for new writers, I'd love to write a sitcom. That's fantastic. But in the meantime, why don't you get yourself a BBC radio credit and get to meet some real producers who make sitcoms? Well, to do that, you've got to just spend 6 weeks, 2 or 3 days a week, 36 hours a week, just trying to write jokes for one show, and it's the same show, and you're doing it for 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, if you're lucky, you might get a radio credit, and that's, we've helped about 58 people do it in the last 5 years. So, it's just a useful thing to have, and it gets you can apply for BBC bursaries and things once you've got your first writing credit. So that's a nice small step to begin with.
What, with all the fields of comedy that you've been involved in terms of writing, how are they all different, and what would you say is the no BS rules for being good at them, or to doing something that's decent?
I never said this before, when people say, oh, you should write every day, and but you should write every day. I think, and that doesn't mean I should try writing jokes every day. It means it's like everything in your life. You want to be able to break down what's going wrong. I mean, you've obviously, I'm aware just talking to you, you've got a very strong self-awareness, when it comes to your current limitations as a writer, I would say. And they are, you're saying, like, for instance, there's too many things, I'm spreading myself too thin, so write a diary entry and get in the habit of writing. And I use, I use pen and paper. I find it's just you've got a physical relationship from your brain to the pen to the paper, and it's just it kind of gives you, it forces you to concentrate just on what you're writing. And so, like today I'm gonna look at how I spread myself too thin. What am I doing? And you just write, for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. It's like, why am I spreading myself too thin? What is it? What am I doing? Once you put a problem out there from your head onto a piece of paper, it takes a while, but eventually you get good at going, right, so this is the problem. And then you start to think of the solutions, but everything takes time. Everything takes longer than you think it will. But yeah, write every day.
And what would you say that no, we already answered this, I think, with stand-up and sitcoms. We definitely already answered it. I was going to ask that. But they're both interesting art forms. I mean, I love sitcoms. Now that I've done a course on like how they all operate, I feel like a kid when I'm writing a sitcom. I feel like if I imagine Malcolm Hardee, I don't know. From right now, just thinking, what if he is a world famous drag act and he is hiding it from his mates?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's larger than life, that's a fairly classic sitcom figure, really. Yeah, and I can't imagine any. I just the idea of Malcolm as a drag act is a very very funny idea, but yeah, the idea that someone is just something that they're not, that's a great comedy thing. You're being you're being something, and that's one of the key things with comedy is, you look at some of the great characters, the difference between who they are and who they think they are, is very much so. Like, I'm thinking like Peep Show is always, I think, is a good example of that. Is that, you think Jez thinks that he's, the life and soul of the party. He's spontaneous. He's kind of the man of the moment. But actually, you can say the same. You can look at him and use very similar words to that and say he's impulsive. He's reckless. He just gets into trouble because he acts before he thinks. But as far as he's concerned, it's like, hey, I'm spontaneous. No, you're not. You're just not thinking before you act. Yeah, and that's why you're always getting into trouble. And Mark is the opposite. He overthinks. So Mark is so cautious. He's like, but in his head, he is a kind of very, very clever. He's the smartest guy in the room. But as everyone else sees this guy and just thinks he's just nobody's, he's just of no interest to anyone because he's just too quiet and doesn't, he's so cautious that he doesn't do stuff. So he's the kind of, so that you put the two of them together and you're just going to get, trouble.
This may be an ageist comment that I'm going to say right now, but and there's probably elements that are completely wrong with this statement. But for a lot of movies and a lot of good writers for movies or TV series or that, I've heard and then maybe seen, they're often a bit older, aren't they? With more life experience. Is life experience important and understanding of the human condition of like having experience of life and understanding different characters vital to being a good like TV writer or director or anything involved with that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought the answer to that was yes. Because even though I loved doing stand-up in my 20s, I always had this idea. I thought, right, when I get to my 30s, I want to be writing sitcom. So I'd taken that on board. But actually, then there was a writer, again, it's a very sad story, really. There's a fantastic writer called Debbie Barham, who I knew for many years but she was very young when she died. But she was like 14 when she started writing, and she was just like, she'd splurge and she wrote and she wrote and she wrote, and she churned out gags and gags and gags. It was all funny stuff. And she was writing sitcoms when she was about 18 and 19. She had a sitcom on Radio 4 with Peter Serafinovich in it. I think it was about a zookeeper or something. But, she was mature beyond her years, and she got very, sadly, she did get very, very ill. And she was in her early 30s when she died, but she was so mature for her age that she was able to write in her 20s, in her late teens, early 20s, the kind of level of sitcom that most people you expect to be in their 30s to be writing like that.
But so the question to that is a good understanding of human psychology and human behavior important for being a good writer and director? That's
I think that's true, actually. Yeah. I mean, not everybody. Some people just write some people are great at writing really funny jokes. Some people are great at writing mad stories, but for me, it's all, I'm very much a character person. I love writing about a character, and it's just like almost a hobby, when I sort of meet somebody. I try not to kind of put people into shows and things, but I sort of get a sense of somebody, and I think, what is the essence of that person? Why do they act the way they do? And it's just, for me, it's the most interesting thing. I'm always curious to know why we are, including myself. I mean, that's when I say write every day. I've written days and days of trying to understand myself. Why did I act that way when I was in my 20s? Why did I respond to that? Why did I act in that weird way yesterday when what was that about? And it was obviously something tied in with my childhood or whatever. So yeah, virtually almost everyone, I think, anyone who's the life that they lead is kind of pretty much based on how they were, what they learned in the first 6 or 7 years of their life. And we just hold on to things that were taught instinctively to us. But if you think about the first 6 to 7 years of your life compared to the first 6 to 7 years of my life, I mean, there would have been a lot of differences and maybe some similarities, but what are the things that you really picked up from when you were young?
You made me think. This is a very weird segue, but I remember watching the Star Trek movie with Data and Picard with Tom Hardy, where he meets a clone of himself, and they're both very different characters. And Data says to him, despite you being the same genome, you both live very different lives, and those experiences have made a unique individual. And I think I'm on the side that I think your circumstances make more of who you are than your genes. But that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I mean, there's a sort of fairly odd sort of story that I've heard. Sorry, I've just got some bit of noise in the background there, but this story about the twin brothers of their dad was an alcoholic, and one of them becomes an alcoholic and one of them doesn't drink at all. And someone says to the first one, "Why are you an alcoholic?" He said, "Because my dad was." And then the other one, "Why don't you ever have a drink?" "Because my dad was an alcoholic." So, they've used exactly the same circumstances, but one has chosen that route and one has chosen that route.
But yeah, it's interesting. But do you believe that though? Are you more of the nature or nurture, would you say?
Yeah, I think. I think people can change, I think, and I think, I do think we tend to say things like, "Oh yeah, well, I'm just, I'm not good at X, Y." I mean, I definitely, just to use an example, I was good enough at stand up to make a living at it and to get quite far with it and to be able to carry on doing it. But the narrative that I then took on board, because these other people were, I was comparing myself to other people, as I mentioned, when these people started coming up and being more successful than me, and I was going, "Oh, well, obviously I'm not good enough." But actually, the me now would say, well, everybody develops in different ways at different times. The me, if I was still doing stand-up now, I would know what to do. I would know to go away. I would know to work on, to think about the things that weren't working. I'd sit down and I'd write every day, because I didn't write every day then. I'd say, why are my gigs not working? What's happening here? So maybe, and back then people didn't have cameras and phones and stuff, so you couldn't see what you were doing wrong, really. So I would have made notes and thought, oh, well, tomorrow I'll try and do this and let's see if that works. And, oh, yeah, that works. So, and I'd sort of gradually find a way back into it. And now, I get to the fourth draft of a book or something, and it's just like, this isn't working, this isn't working, this is working, this isn't. And it's like you just drill into each little thing and say, oh, why is that not working? And that's something that I've definitely learned. Whereas, say, 25 years ago, I would have said, I can't write, I can't do that because I'm not that kind of person. I don't have the discipline to write it. So I just learned it, So I think, nature, nurture, very important. But I think people underestimate their ability to change the narrative they tell about themselves.
That's a very clever way of looking. I don't know. I'm going to steal that, Dave. If there's any issues in my life, I'm writing it down. Why is it?
As I was saying that, I just thought, I'm so glad he's recording this because I thought, I'm really pleased with that. I thought I'm going to have to ask for the note of that because I've never thought of it that way before. But I thought, God, bloody hell.
It's such a clever, simple bit of advice. It's just, whatever issue you have, just keep writing it down and your background brain will sort it out.
That's true. That's what happens. That is what happens. Yeah. So, keep writing. That's what I say.
Now, to anyone that's listening right now, I've got a podcast with a wide variety of listeners. I've got people from America. There was a month we had about 500 in Vietnam. But it's on all pockets across the globe. But I'd say my main two markets are probably America and the UK. But for those that are listening right now, how do they find out about you? You mentioned a lot of stuff already in the podcast, but how do they find out about you? And what are the main bits of advice would you give to anyone getting involved in comedy, whether it be a writer or stand-up or performer?
Yeah, so I would say, well, first of all, I'm doing a podcast myself now. It's called The Shakespeare Mindset, and it's about tips for improving your life the Bard way, not the hard way. Thank you. So that's just about different things you can do in your life, and it turns out that Shakespeare had all the answers to things like, how do you deal with grief? How do you fall in love? How do you why do we always get disappointed by people who get in charge of us and that sort of thing? So Shakespeare Mindset, that's my weekly podcast. And the novels, I've got the first two novels in the sort of vague version of my life and my relationship with Rick Mail when we were students and things. So those are called, first two are called Stand Up Barry Goldman and Barry Goldman, The Wilderness Years. And then the third one, Barry Pulls It Off, is coming out next year. So yeah, that's the main thing. And for people who want to do comedy, you got to do it because you love it. I used to say you can make a living writing comedy. I'm afraid you can't say that anymore. But you want to do it just because you're obsessed and it's fun and you love it and you want to become a better writer. And those are the reasons for doing it. Whatever else you do, just do it because you love it and you want to get better at it. And that's kind of everything, really.
Right. Well, guys, I hope you've enjoyed Dave. It's been a great episode. Definitely the bit where Dave says about if you have a problem, keep writing down in your back of your brain. So that is life advice that I'm taking for a while. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. The next guest, when I look at the calendar, last week was supposed to be Sam Dipley, but we had to rearrange it. But next week it should be a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt instructor who's also a comedian. Jiu-Jitsu is a great sport, guys. But I'll see you in the next episode. All right, take care, guys.